It's time to eat.
What are you hungry for?
Sit down and get ready to consume an abundance of fantasy football knowledge from Ross Tucker and John Daigle.
Feed me now. I'm starving.
On the Fantasy Feast Eatin' podcast.
Yeah, let's eat, baby. It is the Fantasy Feast Eatin' podcast. We are, of course, presented by DraftKings. Love those dudes. The crown is yours. Use the code Ross if you're a new customer. They always got stuff for you over there, which is excellent. We always have stuff for you every week here on the Ross Tucker podcast family of networks. Of course, Greg Cosell every week on the Ross Tucker football podcast. We'll talk receivers with Greg, which is well-timed since obviously we're talking receivers and tight ends that have had free agency implications here from a fantasy standpoint with the great John Daigle, who you can check out on social media like I do at NotJDaigle. Of course, you always want to go to establishtherun.com. I can't emphasize enough how awesome that site is, how great the information is. There's a reason why it helps so many people, not just for fantasy, every type of fantasy, by the way, daily fantasy, best ball, season long, but also on the draft prop bets, which are going to be starting to get hot and heavy starting next week. We'll really dive into those on Even Money Betting podcast and a little bit here with John, since he's like a draft betting savant, which is awesome. So establishtherun.com. Use the code FEAST. I'm at Ross Tucker NFL on social media. I think most of you know, former NFL lineman. Now I got a bunch of broadcasting gigs, which is a lot of fun, and a bunch of shows. Check out College Draft and the Even Money Betting podcast if you have not so far this week. You can, of course, watch any and all youtube.com/Ross Tucker NFL. John, let's get into receivers and tight ends. So last week we did running backs and quarterbacks. And 2 weeks ago, when we were talking about some of the big moves, we did get into Devontae Adams and Chris Godwin. But there's some other big moves to get into since then. You know, these guys aren't switching teams, but I guess I do want to get your thoughts on Ja'Marr Chase and T. Higgins now that they're locked in Cincinnati and locked up with Joe Burrow for the long haul. I guess we assumed and thought they'd both be on the team this year in some capacity. There was some thought that the Bengals could maybe trade T. Higgins, but they're there. They have them. They're going to be Bengals. And does this contract move the needle for either guy for you from a fantasy perspective?
It's hard to move the needle when you are already considered a legitimate asset in fantasy. Ja'Marr Chase, obviously the wide receiver 1 overall in fantasy last year, and being drafted, if you're doing these early drafts on DraftKings, as the first overall wide receiver taken as well. T. Higgins in the back of the second or third round, as he should be. And as I mentioned on past week's episode, what's most exciting about T. Higgins is that for the first time in his career last year, he proved that he can also earn targets whenever Ja'Marr Chase plays as well. Last year in the games that solely he started with Ja'Marr Chase, 12 starts. He earned 8.5 targets and averaged 18.5 fantasy points in those contests, which would be good for wide receiver 7 on the season. So the fact they're bringing all of these guys back, we of course have to cross our fingers and hope that Joe Burrow can be as efficient as he was. It's hard in fantasy when you don't use your legs. Joe Burrow does not. To solely be a top 4 quarterback when you are relying only on passing production. But again, if there's a team that can do that, it's probably the offense that is bringing back both Higgins, Chase, and Mike Gesicki, who we'll talk about later on.
Ooh, good point. You know what? Let's just do it right now. While you're already talking Bengals, let's get into Mike Gesicki and your thoughts on him while we're of a Bengals brain.
So it's a big deal, both in signing and just in terms of the literal paper he signed. 3 years, $25.5 million, including $12 million guaranteed, or a $12 million cap hit in year 1, which we know he at least will be on the roster for. But my issue with the signing for fantasy is that we saw last year people could not even use Mike Gesicki in fantasy football if T. Higgins was healthy. In the 5 games that T. Higgins missed, Mike Gesicki was the tight end 4 in points with an 18.5% target share. But whenever T. Higgins played, he averaged 6 fantasy points, which was the tight end 33 with only a 10% target share. And so we're doing these best ball drafts on DraftKings. I keep mentioning it on the show. There's actually a lot of nuance to it and a lot of skill that's required. But even though I cite those differences, that Gesicki just wasn't used whenever Higgins was available, in best ball, you also take on risk. You leverage injuries, since obviously a lot can happen from the time we're doing this show to the end of the year. And so right now, Gesicki's going at the end of the drafts because, again, he wasn't really a fantasy asset whenever Higgins was available. But even at the end of drafts, he can provide value because Higgins could obviously get injured, and then Gesicki is right back in that spot I mentioned where he was a top 5 starting tight end. So if you're still taking him in the 15-16 round on DraftKings, that's totally fine, but I am worried for his week-to-week usage because I bet when we get to August and home leagues are drafting, they're going to treat him as if he's a weekly starter, and at least last year he showed us he is not in this offense.
Man, there's a lot of receivers to get to.
Yep.
I think maybe the biggest name guy would be Cooper Kupp with the Seahawks, which is interesting. I talked to Greg Cosell about this last week, just in terms of, Kupp being a guy that has a lot of similar skill set to Jackson Smith and Jigba up there in Seattle.
I'm glad that was Greg Cosell's take because that's why I still have a question mark about this fit. I don't think it's necessarily an awful deal for Seattle, but we just don't know how JSN and Cooper Kupp will overlap, since Kupp, obviously, Los Angeles slot receiver for his entire career, even with Puka Nacua available the last couple of seasons. But JSN, that's also where he's fit in Seattle. 67% and 79% slot rate the last 2 years. 79% last season, of course, was when he had that career emergence in the second half of the season alongside DK Metcalf. And so who's playing the slot? Is Seattle actually going to ask a 32-year-old Cooper Kupp to win from the outside? And more importantly, for our purposes, can a 32-year-old Kupp win from the outside? Given that we saw last year whenever he returned from injury in his last 5 games, just 10 total catches and couldn't earn a 16% target share in any of those starts. Who is Cooper Kupp now under Clint Kubiak in Seattle? And I still have major question marks for that. So as both him and JSN earn targets closer to the line of scrimmage, I don't know what this offense is. I don't know how potent it is. I still want to be all in on JSN as the fantasy winner here. Like for Davante Adams, we talked about last week, Puka Nacua can still be a top 6 wide receiver, even with Davante Adams available there. They can honestly both soak up 60% of Los Angeles targets, and we wouldn't question it at all. Matthew Stafford just wouldn't throw the ball anywhere else. But for JSN and Kupp, if they soaked up a majority of targets, it honestly may not even be exciting given where they both earn targets on the field. So I'm still going to draft JSN everywhere, but Kupp, I'm still questioning the fit right now.
Right, and I think you referenced this, but they got MVS as kind of their deep guy,
Yep.
take the top off the defense from what Kubiak did with him. Speaking of where Kupp used to be, the Rams, they gave Tutu Atwell $10 million for 1 year. It seems to me, John, like they're going to use him. I mean, I know they still have Puka Nacua and they brought in Davante Adams, but $10 million is no joke for Tutu Atwell.
And Tutu Atwell led all receivers in pre-snap motion last year. And I think that's because, I can't remember what Sean McVay calls it. I think it's called the peekaboo personnel, because Tutu Atwell is so small that when he runs behind the line of scrimmage, like you can't see him behind the offensive lineman. And so they put Tutu in motion purposely so that he can gain a head of steam and then hit the ground running as a small, fast receiver whenever the ball is snapped timely. But again, Tutu Atwell for his career has not been a guy who earns targets. He did just fine last year, and $10 million guaranteed is nothing to shake off. He's going to be in 3 wide receiver sets, especially after Demarcus Robinson signed with the 49ers. But This is Puka Nacua and Devontae Adams who we're talking about. Guys who hog targets. Guys who have plays schemed intently for them because they are still that good. And so I just don't think Tutu Atwell is going to be able to provide enough weekly for fantasy. It's still going, in my opinion, to flow all through Puka and Adams. I mentioned this stat last week, but I'm going to say it again for everyone here. And that to me is, this stat is why I'm still boasting Puka as a top 3 or top 4 receiver in the mid-first round for fantasy. And that's because that even in the 9 games he played with Cooper Kupp last year, Puka earned a 35% target share. It's still a ungodly number. And so even with someone as strong as Devontae Adams, I still think Puka can be the team's leading target getter.
You referenced Demarcus Robinson going to the Niners. No longer being with the Rams. Always interesting when these guys stay in division, right? Demarcus Robinson from the Rams to the Niners, Cooper Kupp from the Rams to the Seahawks. Does Demarcus Robinson on the Niners do anything for you, John?
It's not an apples-to-apples situation, since Demarcus Robinson does not just plug in for Deebo Samuel. They are 2 entirely different players, and they have been using their careers in entirely different ways. But the last couple of seasons, when Demarcus Robinson has been available as the Rams' 3rd receiver behind Puka and Cooper Kupp, how Sean McVay used him was as a red zone and end zone kind of guy. He's the one who soaked up end zone targets even more so than Cooper Kupp when they've shared the field together the last 2 years. And so does Kyle Shanahan, who has obviously now seen a lot of games by Demarcus Robinson, does he use him in a similar fashion, and how does he fit in? I don't think it deters the fantasy value of Juwan Jennings, who, remember, with Deebo Samuel off the field last year, soaked up an absurd 41% target share. Showed us, in my opinion, out of nowhere, that he can actually be a team's wide receiver 1, and a very good one at that. And Ricky Pearsall, who, and the 2 games that Deebo Samuel missed at the end of the year, Pearsall closed the year. A lot of teams were done in fantasy, so they didn't notice this. But 8 catches for 141 yards and a touchdown, and 6 catches for 69 yards and a touchdown in those last 2 games without Deebo. I don't think Demarcus Robinson infiltrates what Pearsall and Jennings bring to the field here as the 49ers clear-cut top 2 wide receivers, while Brandon Ayuk is still mending from November's torn ACL. But Robinson does at least give this team a 3rd wide receiver on packages that are not schemed for George Kittle whenever Ayuk is not available.
That was an awesome weekend of basketball. I thoroughly enjoyed that while sipping on some delicious Smirnoff. You guys already know the mixtures I like to use. By the way, we got the Sweet 16 already coming up again this weekend, starting Thursday night. Smirnoff, not only an official sponsor of this show, the NFL Draft, it's the perfect vodka for crafting delicious cocktails, easy to make, versatile for any and all fans over 21. Please drink responsibly. Smirnoff number 21 vodka, distilled from grain, 40% alcohol by volume. The Smirnoff Company, New York, New York. Please not share with anyone under legal drinking age. We are a month away from the NFL Draft. Smirnoff, my number 1 pick when it comes to vodka, because first of all, it tastes delicious. Secondly, it's inexpensive. It's not going to cost you an arm and a leg. Smirnoff. What about Joshua Palmer with the Bills? That's an interesting one for me, John, that we hadn't touched on yet. They gave him pretty darn good money. You know, they moved on from Mack Hollins, so maybe we can talk about both those guys. Mack Hollins with the Patriots, and I guess more or less his replacement, Joshua Palmer with the Bills.
You mentioned a lot of money, and you are correct. 3 years, $36 million, including $18 million guaranteed. Recall that they also re-signed Khalil Shakir to a massive deal in the offseason as well. So these are the 2 guys, after losing Mack Hollins, that Buffalo is clearly most confident in. Josh Palmer's never been someone who could earn targets necessarily amid the Chargers' crowded wide receivers room, since a majority of the time he did overlap with Keenan Allen and Mike Williams. Last year, we saw Quentin Johnston's breakout season among Ladd McConkey, who also proved he's a legitimate wide receiver one, especially in the second half of the year. And so it didn't work out for Josh Palmer. But there is a skeleton key in fantasy, and that's basically taking advantage of dipping ADPs for reactionary reasons from year to year. And Josh Palmer is someone who was coveted highly because everyone just had written off Quentin Johnston in that time and assumed he could not do anything after failing in his first year as a rookie. And so Josh Palmer was being drafted highly. This year now, Josh Palmer, not drafted highly. And it is admittedly a crowded wide receiver room for Buffalo, but if he were to be the guy who stood out the most over Keon Coleman, without Amari Cooper, Dalton Kincaid is still used in a similar way to, let's say, Cooper Kupp, where he gets shallow targets. He's not used downfield at all. Then it wouldn't shock me if Josh Palmer did lead the team in receiving touchdowns, because that's also not where they used Khalil Shakir. They used him underneath, near the line of scrimmage, and not in the red zone at all. So Josh Palmer, I think, is a sneaky sleeper for fantasy, assuming he can win that wide receiver 2 role from the outside from the preseason on.
What about Mack Hollins then for the Patriots, John, who still are lacking at receiver?
And the Patriots could throw a big wrench here in the first round, given that we think Travis Hunter could be on their board. We just don't know what direction they'll go in year one under Mike Vrabel. But as it stands right now, there is a chance that Mack Hollins truly does lead this team in receiving yards. It's a dark horse chance, and it's crazy to say that, but also the last time he played under Josh McDaniels in 2022 with the Raiders, that's when Mack Hollins had a career high with 94 targets, 690 receiving yards, and averaged 9 fantasy points per game. Drake May, among last year's roster, obviously needed someone to get downfield, and for whatever Mack Hollins brings to the team, he did earn Josh Allen's trust downfield and did stand out as much as you could stand out among an offense that rotated everyone under Joe Brady. So I do think Mack Hollins, at least right now, is a fine late-round flyer, and that opinion may change post-draft if the Patriots do add someone of impact in the first round.
What about some of these other one-year deal guys? You know, there's some big-name guys. Probably should have talked about this when we were talking about Ladd McConkey, but Mike Williams going back with Justin Herbert with the Chargers.
Also another late-round flyer guy. It didn't work out for the Jets. It didn't work out for the Chargers. I understand all that, but at least we know he has rapport with Justin Herbert from their past years together. And also, this team still needs a third wide receiver. All they did, the Chargers, was sign Jalen Reagor as depth. Reagor, who has mostly been a special teams guy. So Mike Williams, as it stands right now, is their wide receiver 3 whenever they go to 11 personnel. So I don't mind a late-round flyer in him.
All right, DeAndre Hopkins with the Ravens. There had been reports after the Super Bowl that DeAndre Hopkins was going to retire, but evidently that was not the case.
Yeah, and it makes me worried that he will just be the same individual that he was with the Chiefs and really just unimpactful and a rotational guy. The Ravens also have shown us that they will do this whenever a receiver reaches the end of their career. They did so with Odell Beckham, Dez Bryant, Steve Smith, Deshaun Jackson, the list goes on. Unfortunately, for as great of a career and great of a human being as DeAndre Hopkins is, he just seems to fit in that mold of guys where the Ravens are trying to squeeze the last inch of juice out of him. I'm just not sure it's there anymore. So I think DeAndre Hopkins will be a guy come August home leagues that is being overvalued for his name, but he's genuinely someone I wouldn't touch in 15-round leagues.
Hollywood Brown back with the Chiefs.
Hollywood Brown, though, I do think is a good value right now. A 1-year, $5 million deal, also signed just for 1 year last season, and then, of course, got injured in the preseason and didn't play until the second half of the year in the playoffs. But last year, at this time, Hollywood Brown was being drafted in the 10th, 11th round, and I would argue that his outlook this season is even better than it was at this time last year, because we don't know the Rashee Rice situation. It sounds like Rice could be still recovering or hobbled at least the first month or two of the season. And then, of course, the Xavier Worthy unfortunate arrest and situation that's happened in the past couple of weeks. So right now, at least on the field, Hollywood Brown is going to walk into a starting role. And be a full year removed from last season's injury. And so at full strength, I do think Hollywood Brown could be someone that we sneak in at value compared to last year's ADP.
A lot of people scoring points this weekend in March Madness. You can score points at Labatt by getting gear for buying beer. Listen, the Labatt merch, I have a bunch of it. It's incredible. And you can get it just by snapping a photo of your receipt, uploading it instantly to rack up points for exclusive merch. Any store, any bar, stadium, doesn't matter. Buy beer, get gear. Go to rewards.labattusa.com to sign up. All right, so I may get back to the receivers in a little bit, but I wanted to get your thoughts on a couple of tight end moves. Probably the biggest one, in terms of fantasy might be Evan Engram with the Broncos.
Evan Engram is a massive one, so much so that everyone saw Sean Payton went to Twitter the moment Engram was signed and then tweeted a picture of the Joker, because that is clearly the role that Evan Engram is going to play. 2 years, $23 million, $16.5 million guaranteed. I also think this deal, as Sean Payton gets the guy who can move entirely around the formation, this will take the Broncos out of Penn State tight end Tyler Warren at number 20 overall. Tyler Warren, who, as we do these draft episodes moving on from week to week through April, we'll talk about him, but people will come to find out he's a similar version of George Kittle. I think is a good comp, because Tyler Warren also stays into block, runs a lot of his routes in line, and is also an incredibly good receiver. But this deal with Engram, it's a similar player as well, and so the Broncos have no need for that kind of style of player at number 20 unless they truly want to run their base out of 12 personnel. But the last 2 years in Jacksonville, Evan Engram has finished as the tight end 6 and tight end 15 in fantasy. And that's because he has earned his targets near the line of scrimmage. Jacksonville used him mostly as similar to how the Bills use Khalil Shakir, as a possession receiver to help move the chains. And so I believe that's also how Sean Payton's going to use him, but in a myriad of ways. In line, from the slot, out of the backfield at times, from out wide. And I look at Bo Nix's target share to tight ends last year, which finished 31st in the league, and I don't tell myself Bo Nix won't throw to tight ends. I say he looked up and saw Greg Dulcich, Adam Troutman, and Lucas Kroll. That's why Bo Nix didn't throw to tight ends. Now, with Evan Engram being used as more of a receiver, I do think Engram can have a very safe, high-floor season for fantasy. And so, yes, I believe Engram from day one on is going to be a low-end tight end one.
That reminds me, John, I didn't get a chance to ask you about Dyami Brown with the Jags. You talking about the Jags and Evan Engram reminded me. What do you think about Dyami Brown, who had that great postseason for Washington down there in Jacksonville opposite Brian Thomas?
$10 million guaranteed, and as we talked about with Cooper Kupp and Jackson Smith and Jigba, Dyami Brown plays the same role as Gabe Davis. Both of them, the last year, ran at least 77% of the routes from the outside. And so I don't think this is as simple as like pushing one to the slot, where, again, neither of them really play. And unlike the JSN Kupp situation, where Kupp is not ever going to unseat JSN because Jackson Smith and Jigba is such an important part, integral piece of Seattle's passing offense, Gabe Davis arguably isn't. And he was resigned by the past regime that is not Liam Cohen's. And so I think there's a real chance that Dyami Brown just unseats Gabe Davis altogether. And he's the one who is used more in two wide receiver sets over Gabe Davis alongside Brian Thomas.
The other tight end I wanted to ask you about is Juwan Johnson. Now, he's back in New Orleans with the Saints, but he's got a new head coach and play caller in Kellen Moore.
Let me ask you really quickly, did you see anything, and it's hard with the Eagles offense because it runs in through the air through Devonta Smith and A.J. Brown, but did you see anything interesting or progressive in how Kellen Moore used Dallas Goedert last year?
Yes. And in fact, so the problem was Goddard was in and out of the lineup. I think he made two different stints on IR, but I mean, he had maybe the play of the season on a crossing route against the Saints that he took like 70 yards for a touchdown. That was huge. And then people forget, even with Saquon, even with those receivers, Dallas Goedert had a dominant postseason for the Eagles. I mean, that Packers game, he was like the go-to guy for the Eagles in the playoffs. So I would think that Kellen Moore and Derek Carr would like to target Juwan Johnson, interestingly enough, from the Philadelphia area, from South Jersey. I think there's a reason why they brought him back, and it's because Kellen Moore, you go back to Dallas, with Dalton Schultz or Ferguson, clearly Kellen Moore values the tight end position.
And values it so much that they gave Juwan a massive deal. 3 years, $30.7 million, including $21.2 guaranteed. Juwan Johnson is also coming off career highs last year. It may have not been noticed by many people, but under Clint Kubiak, in targets, career high in receiving across the board, 50 catches for 548 yards and 3 touchdowns, a 76% catch rate, and 8.3 yards per target. Johnson, who is purely a receiving tight end, I love that you mentioned how Kellen used not only Goedert last year in the postseason, but also his past tight ends. With Johnson being a pure receiving tight end, that tells me he's going to get Juwan Johnson involved behind Chris Olave, and we will see how Rashid Shaheed is recovering from week 1. But I do think that given the fact that Johnson has been a high touchdown scorer in past years as well, that we are seeing a sneaky potential tight end 1 season for Juwan Johnson in fantasy, and he's going to be overlooked in home leagues come August.
I would imagine that's the case. Anything quick on Westbrook-Ikhine with the Dolphins? He always fascinates me. Just tough there with Tyreek Hill and Waddle.
Well, you say Tyreek Hill and Waddle, but it's also tough there because they showed they don't mind running through Jonnu Smith during weeks as well. So the only issue is that Nick Westbrook-Ikhine, even with 9 touchdowns, averaged only a catch and a half per game. It was outlier numbers, and now he has to compete with 3 different receivers. I'm just not sure there are enough mouths to feed there. He's going to definitely be their 3rd wide receiver, but what does that mean for fantasy? I think we're still trying to sort through.
Check him out at Not J Daigle. He is excellent. Establish the run. Just make sure you use that code FEAST. I'm at Ross Tucker NFL. We're at Ross Tucker Pod. I am stuffed. We're done.
Thanks for tuning in to Fantasy Feast. Make sure to also check out the Ross Tucker Football Podcast, Even Money, and College Draft, all on the DraftKings Network, YouTube, or subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform.